In a world where professionalism and prejudice collide, Michelle Borges, a determined young cop, finds herself at the center of an unexpected confrontation during what should have been a routine flight. Exhausted from a day full of intense operations, Michelle faces more than just fatigue when a simple seat contest turns into a test of character and determination. As tensions rise between her and the flight crew, led by a strict and seemingly prejudiced assistant, Michelle must navigate not only the physical discomfort but also the emotional weight of standing up for her rights in an environment that seems to be stacked against her. This story delves into the themes of resilience, justice, and the power to stand up against discrimination. Through Michelle's journey, you'll be drawn into a narrative that challenges social norms, examines the impact of prejudice on everyday situations, and ultimately inspires a call for change. How does a single encounter aboard an airplane become a catalyst for transformation within an entire industry? And how does a woman's strength in the face of adversity set the stage for lasting change? Dive into this compelling story to find out. Michelle Borges was exhausted. The young police officer, 31 years old, had spent the day in a series of operations and meetings that seemed endless. Throughout her life, she had experienced prejudice multiple times because of the color of her skin, but over time, she learned to fight against it. The heat and chaos of Florida had been draining, and now the only thing she wanted was to find her seat on the flight to Georgia, relax, and forget about the worries that had been weighing on her. The fatigue was evident on her face, with dark circles under her eyes, and her steps seemed to drag through the airport corridors. When she arrived at the boarding gate, the fluorescent lights and the constant hum of the aircraft were already starting to wear on her patience. This flight was not just a break from her routine, it was also a small escape from an especially difficult day. Michelle sat in the waiting area, trying not to think about the problems that still needed to be resolved and focusing only on waiting for the boarding call. Finally, the voice announcement called her group, and she stood up, trying to stretch her tired muscles as she walked toward the plane. The cramped and narrow space of the airplane seemed like a natural extension of the long journey she had endured. When she reached her seat, 25A, she was met by a young man who was already sitting there, completely absorbed in a newspaper that looked like it was seconds away from tearing from overhandling. Michelle frowned and took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Excuse me, but this is my seat," she said, her voice tinged with exhaustion but still polite. The young man, with a distracted look, raised his head, and instead of standing up immediately, he looked at her with a disinterested expression. "I don't think there's been a mistake. This seat is mine. It's what they gave me when I checked in." Michelle blinked, surprised by the response. "I really don't think so. I believe you're in the wrong seat." The young man didn't seem bothered by the situation and simply went back to focusing on the newspaper. "Sorry, but my boarding pass says this is my seat. You can check yours too, if you like," she said, shaking her head, trying to keep her exhaustion from turning her frustration into anger. "I've already checked. And besides, we have a problem here because seat 25A is assigned to me." The young man sighed and, with a resigned expression, put down the newspaper but didn't get up. "Look, maybe there's some confusion, but I'm not going to move until you can prove this is your seat." Michelle felt a chill down her spine as she realized the situation was about to become more complicated. She had spent the day resolving conflicts, and now it seemed she was about to face another, albeit much less formal. With visible effort, she tried to maintain her composure and prepared to resolve the impasse in a civilized manner, even though her desire to just sit down and rest was growing stronger. Michelle looked again at the ticket in her hand, the numbers and letters blending into a blur of frustration and fatigue. 25A was exactly what was written on the paper she held. She compared the ticket with the young man's boarding pass, which was now resting on the seat and showed an identical number to hers. The confusion grew, but she was determined to resolve the issue without causing more commotion. "Look," Michelle tried a more conciliatory approach, "I know this must be inconvenient for you too, but I need my seat. I've checked my ticket, and it confirms that 25A is my seat. There might have been a mistake, but there's no reason we can't resolve this." Before the young man could respond, a flight attendant approached. Carlos, in his immaculate uniform and with the expression of someone who didn't seem to have much time for negotiations, looked at Michelle with a mixture of impatience and concern. "What's going on here? Is this lady bothering you?" Carlos asked, looking back and forth between Michelle and the young man. The pressure was starting to build, and Michelle felt a weight on her shoulders, as if the situation was becoming even more complicated than she had imagined. "This is my seat," Michelle quickly explained. "I've already spoken to the young man, and he said he also has a ticket for seat 25A. I just want him to move so I can sit down." Carlos sighed, the fatigue visible on his face. "Look, the flight is about to take off, and all the seats are occupied. We can't waste any more time on this. I'm going to have to ask you to find another seat." Michelle felt a pang of frustration. "I've done everything I can. It's not fair that I have to find a new seat when the mistake isn't mine. I don't even know if there's another seat available." Carlos looked around, checking the already crowded rows of the plane. "Look, I understand your situation, but right now we're operating at full capacity. We can't delay the takeoff because of a mistake. If there's a problem, you'll have to talk to the ground staff. But for now, you need to find another seat, hopefully. Maybe an airplane isn't the right place for people like you." Michelle, feeling her frustration build, made one last attempt to resolve the situation. With a steady gaze and a slightly raised voice, she addressed Carlos. "Carlos, there's really been a mistake here. I need my seat because this flight is extremely important to me. I can't just miss it. I don't know what you meant by that, but I'll ignore it so we don't have any bigger problems." Carlos, with an impassive and clearly bored look, maintained his rigid stance. "Look, I've already told you, all the seats are occupied. If you can't resolve this on your own, you'll have to disembark. We can't delay the flight over a seat problem." Michelle felt a knot of frustration form in her stomach. "I'm here on an official mission. Isn't there anything that can be done to let me stay? Is there any chance I could be moved to first class, for example? I really can't miss this flight." Carlos scoffed and shook his head disdainfully. "You, in first class?" As if, he laughed before adding, "Even so, there are no seats available right now. If you can't resolve this, the best thing to do is to disembark and deal with it with the ground staff. That's all we can do at this point." Carlos's harsh response was a heavy blow to Michelle. She looked around, desperation growing in her chest. In a last-ditch effort, she turned to other crew members who were helping passengers settle in. "Please, I really need help. Is there any other seat available? I'm on an official mission, and I can't miss this flight." However, her pleas were met with indifference. One flight attendant shook her head and walked away without offering assistance, while another just looked at her with a blank expression, as if unwilling to get involved. Every attempt to find a solution seemed to be ignored, and Michelle's discomfort grew with each passing moment. Desperate and feeling that her options were running out, Michelle turned back to Carlos, hoping he could at least show some understanding or empathy. However, he remained as inflexible as a rock, and his hostile attitude left no room for negotiation. The plane was about to start moving for takeoff, and Michelle felt a sense of helplessness settle in, knowing that the situation was rapidly deteriorating and that she was about to lose her only chance to resolve the issue before reaching her destination. As the plane was about to taxi down the runway, Michelle sat on her bag in an improvised seat, trying to hide the frustration and humiliation she felt. Despair mixed with a growing sense of injustice, and she couldn't believe she was facing this situation. But then, a young passenger who was sitting nearby stood up, clearly upset with how Carlos was treating Michelle. "Excuse me, but this isn't fair," the young woman said firmly, addressing Carlos. "She's trying to solve a problem that isn't hers, and you're being completely inflexible. This is not how passengers should be treated, especially with insinuations about her background." Carlos looked at the young woman with a mixture of surprise and irritation. "I understand your concern," he replied coldly, "but I'm following protocol. The flight can't wait, and the decision has been made. If she can't resolve this, she'll have to disembark." The young woman was extremely indignant, but Carlos left no room for further discussion. "There's nothing more to say about this. If there's a problem, it'll be resolved when the plane lands, whether she's on the flight or not." At this point, Michelle's desolate gaze met Carlos's, but she realized he was firm in his decision, with no empathy for her dilemma. The young passenger, frustrated with Carlos's attitude, sat back down, while Michelle felt increasingly powerless. Before she could recover, Carlos approached Michelle and, in a brusque gesture, signaled for her to follow him. "Come with me," he ordered, with a firmness that made it clear there was no room for protest. With her heart pounding, Michelle followed Carlos to a discreet door at the back of the plane, leading her to a restricted area where the flight attendant's cabin was located. Carlos opened the door and gestured for her to enter. Michelle stepped inside with a growing sense of apprehension. As soon as the door closed behind them, the atmosphere changed drastically. Carlos, now away from the passenger's eyes, dropped any pretense of civility. His tone was now sharp and hostile. "I'm the head of the flight attendants on this aircraft. No one above me can change my decision. If you don't like it, that's your problem." Michelle, already worn out by the situation, felt a mix of humiliation and frustration. "I'm just trying to do my job. I don't understand why you're doing this to me." Carlos stared at her with a cold look, his eyes devoid of any compassion. "What you don't understand is that we're following rules and protocols that can't be changed on a whim. If you can't accept that, then the only thing left for you is to disembark. As I said, maybe an airplane isn't the right place for someone like you." The hostility in Carlos's voice was palpable. He seemed to be enjoying the control he had over the situation to reinforce his position, in addition to his own prejudices. Michelle felt a wave of helplessness as she realized that her words were having no effect. The sense of injustice was intensifying, and the humiliation of being treated this way in the context of her work and mission there was almost unbearable. Desolate, Michelle realized that she was completely out of options. The head flight attendant was clearly determined to stick to his decision, and her attempts to find a reasonable solution had been exhausted. She found herself forced to accept her new reality, even if it meant swallowing the bitter feeling of defeat and frustration. With no other choice, Michelle decided to disembark from the plane, feeling frustrated and humiliated. Every step toward the airplane door felt heavier than the last, and her mind was filled with thoughts of indignation and helplessness. The shame of being forced to disembark, especially because of Carlos's inflexible attitude, was almost unbearable. As she exited, Michelle passed by the passengers who were already settled in their seats. Their curious looks, mixed with expressions of sympathy and perplexity, did nothing to ease the sense of embarrassment she carried. She headed for the disembarkation door with a feeling of sadness and injustice that seemed to intensify with every moment. With the airplane door finally closing behind her, Michelle found herself back in the boarding area, not knowing exactly what to do next. The sound of the airplane's engines faded, and the buzz of passengers waiting began to fade into the background of her desperate situation. As the plane took off, a discussion began to form among the passengers inside the aircraft. The central theme was Carlos's behavior and how he had treated Michelle. The young passenger who had stood up to defend her was at the center of the discussion, expressing her indignation clearly and determinedly. "I can't believe what happened," she said, her voice filled with anger and frustration. That flight attendant not only ignored a situation that was clearly a mistake but was also completely disrespectful. "This is an abuse of power." Other passengers began murmuring in agreement, in conversations full of discontent. "He could have been more understanding," commented a nearby woman. "It's unacceptable for someone to be treated like that, especially in a situation like this. I'm going to report his behavior to the airport management as soon as we land," the young woman continued, with a firmness that indicated she wasn't willing to let the matter rest. "This can't go unnoticed. Someone needs to do something about the way he treated that woman, especially after those prejudiced comments." The tension inside the airplane was palpable. The passengers were clearly divided, with some speaking out against Carlos's attitude and others expressing skepticism about the effectiveness of complaints. The buzz and murmurs intensified, creating an atmosphere of general discontent. "I've heard he's known for being difficult," said a man, his voice filled with disgust. "But I never thought he'd stoop so low. It's sad to see how people with a little power can behave like this," commented another woman. "I hope this doesn't go unnoticed, and he gets some kind of punishment." As the discussion unfolded, Michelle was still at the Florida airport, still stuck at her point of origin. Her heart was heavy with the feeling that, although the problem was recognized by others, there was nothing that could be done to reverse what had already happened. She knew the episode would leave a permanent mark as one of the many instances of prejudice she had faced, and that the process of resolving that situation and seeking justice would be difficult. Despite the passengers' indignation and the growing sense of solidarity around her, Michelle wasn't keeping up with it all. She had to accept that, for the moment, her options were limited. With one last look at the boarding gate, Michelle saw the plane take to the skies and fly away. She then prepared to deal with the consequences and find a way to move forward, while feeling the weight of the situation and the frustration of a mission that seemed to have started on the wrong foot. Even so, Michelle realized she needed to draw strength from where she had none and called the authorities at the Georgia airport, the destination of the flight, as well as some important executives of the airline, with whom she had direct contact. At the same time, Carlos tried to maintain a facade of indifference as the plane completed its takeoff and the discussion about his conduct intensified among the passengers. However, as the buzz grew and the murmurs of discontent turned into an increasingly loud and intense conversation, he could no longer ignore the pressure on him. Deep down, a sense of regret began to settle in his mind. He knew he had a significant responsibility as the head of the flight attendants, and the way he handled Michelle's situation was beginning to reflect negatively on his reputation. The passengers' animated discussion, now with comments about the need for a formal complaint and a possible investigation, made Carlos realize the magnitude of the mistake he had made. As the plane flew, the tension on board was at its peak. The young woman who had stood up to defend Michelle was now talking to other passengers about how to gather witnesses for a formal complaint, and many were willing to support the young woman and report Carlos's conduct. This added significant weight to the situation. Carlos tried to continue with his duties, but his focus was scattered. He knew the flight was being recorded by cameras and that the complaints could be verified by the airline's customer service records. He was already imagining the consequences of a possible investigation and how it could affect his future. As the aircraft finally approached the runway in Georgia, Carlos felt a knot of anxiety form in his stomach. The flight had been relatively calm for the most part, but the atmosphere among the passengers was tense and filled with discontent. As the plane touched down and the pilot began to guide it to the gate, Carlos and the crew prepared to disembark right after the passengers. The scene seemed routine, with the crew performing their final procedures and getting ready to leave the plane. However, what he didn't know was that a team of airport authorities was already waiting for them. As soon as the plane parked and the door was opened, Carlos and the crew were met by an airport security team and representatives from the airline's management. The group was clearly prepared to handle the situation seriously and professionally, in direct response to the growing dissatisfaction of the passengers and the complaints that had been made. Carlos felt a chill run down his spine when he noticed the presence of the authorities. The words of discontent and the threats of complaints that had surfaced on board had materialized into a reality he could no longer ignore. He braced himself for what was to come, clearly remorseful. The way he had handled the situation had become a palpable concern about the repercussions and the potential impact on his career. As the passengers finished gathering their luggage, many shot looks, and, in some cases, looks of satisfaction, at Carlos and his team. The feeling of being at the center of a storm intensified for him as the situation continued to unfold. Carlos found himself in a vulnerable position, aware that the consequences of his actions would go beyond the mere discomfort of the moment. He hoped that by facing the authorities, he could explain his actions and minimize the damage, but he knew that the path to resolving the issue would be difficult and that his reputation was at stake. Carlos walked down the terminal corridor. His heart was racing, and his mind was swirling with thoughts of worry and anxiety. The airline representatives, accompanied by the authorities, informed him that he would be subject to a disciplinary hearing to judge his actions. The weight of what was to come seemed unbearable, and he knew he needed to prepare for it. The announcement that he would have to attend a hearing immediately was not something he wanted to face, but he knew the situation couldn't be ignored. When Carlos entered a reserved room, he realized that everyone in the room was preparing for the hearing. In his own mind, he tried to come up with a solid justification for his actions during the flight, convinced that following protocol was his main defense. Carlos mentally rehearsed what he would say, focusing on how he could downplay his role in the situation and emphasize that he was simply following established rules. The fear that his decision to act rigidly might have been a mistake mingled with the hope that, with a good explanation, he could mitigate the consequences. The hearing began with the panel of airline authorities and airport management representatives gathered. Carlos sat in a chair next to a lawyer provided by the airline, with a tense posture and nerves on edge. The room was charged with an atmosphere of formality and expectation, and Carlos felt the weight of the scrutiny on him. "Carlos," began the lead representative of the hearing, "you're here to clarify your conduct during flight number 245. Given the volume of complaints and the dissatisfaction expressed by passengers, we'd like to hear your version of events and understand your perspective." Carlos paused, taking a moment to breathe deeply before speaking. "Certainly," he began, trying to keep his voice steady. "I understand the seriousness of the situation. My goal during the flight was simply to follow protocol. When Mrs. Michelle Borges presented a problem with her seat, I limited myself to applying the rules we were given. Unfortunately, the protocol left no room for flexibility, and I acted according to the guidelines I have." He continued, detailing his perspective that all the measures taken were within what was expected of his role. Carlos made a point of emphasizing that he was only ensuring that the flight could depart without additional delays and that the boarding and seating procedure was something he had no power to alter. However, the surprise came when an airline employee stood up and announced the presence of a key witness. "Sorry to interrupt," the employee said, "but we have a statement from one of the passengers on board who claims to have witnessed the interaction between you and Mrs. Borges in more detail." Carlos froze, and his thoughts immediately turned to the young passenger who had spoken up during the flight. He hadn't expected the witness to be called so directly, and he felt a chill run down his spine as he imagined what she might say. The young woman's words and the potential impact of her statement began to form in his mind. The witness, a young woman whom Carlos recognized as the passenger who had spoken up during the flight, began to describe the situation with a level of detail that seemed to go beyond what Carlos had expected. She spoke about how Carlos had treated Michelle, describing not only his rigidity but also the disrespectful attitude and lack of empathy he had shown. Moreover, she continued, he seemed to imply that Michelle didn't belong there because of the color of her skin. "I can't accept that because it's a clear display of prejudice." The young woman's account had a clear impact on the hearing. The descriptions of how Carlos had ignored Michelle's plea for help and how his attitude had contributed to a tense and unpleasant situation began to weigh against him. Carlos's attempt to justify his actions as strictly a matter of following protocols was overshadowed by the witness's words, which revealed a more critical and human perspective on the incident. Now, clearly shaken, Carlos realized that his defense needed an urgent overhaul. The impact of the witness's statements and how they highlighted the lack of sensitivity in his approach were becoming a much bigger challenge than he had anticipated. The hearing continued, and the sense that the judgment was leaning against him began to take hold. As soon as the witness finished her statement, Carlos's heart pounded even faster when he heard that Michelle would testify via video conference. The tension in the hearing room was palpable, and Carlos's nervousness only increased. He had underestimated the seriousness of the incident, but now Michelle's presence, with her personal and detailed testimony, was about to put his situation at even greater risk. The hearing representative motioned for the video conference screen to be activated. Immediately, Michelle's image appeared on the screen, with an expression of seriousness that reflected the gravity of what she was about to recount. Even from a distance, Michelle's posture demonstrated both the professionalism and determination with which she was addressing the situation. "Good afternoon, everyone," Michelle began, her voice clear and firm. "Thank you for the opportunity to share my account of what happened during flight number 245. Carlos felt a chill down his spine upon hearing Michelle's voice. He knew that her version of events was about to be detailed and that she would have the chance to expose the impact of his behavior. The attentive gaze of the hearing panel members was fixed on the screen, waiting for her account. "I'd like to explain," Michelle continued, "that my main concern during the flight wasn't just the seat issue but how I was treated. Flight attendant Carlos's attitude wasn't just a lapse in judgment, it was a clear demonstration of racial prejudice." The hearing room fell silent as Michelle's words were heard. Carlos swallowed hard as the weight of his actions began to sink in. He knew that the term racial prejudice carried significant weight and that his defense would need to address a serious accusation. Michelle continued with a detailed account of the interaction. "When I approached flight attendant Carlos to resolve the seat issue, he was inflexible but also disrespectful. What should have been a simple correction turned into an unnecessary confrontation. Moreover, his attitude was marked by a lack of empathy that can only be interpreted as prejudice." She paused to let her words resonate. "To provide some context, in addition to being a police officer, I also hold a senior position in the airline's security division, as I'm nearing retirement. That's why my mission was precisely to evaluate the crew's performance." Carlos's behavior compromised the standard of service we expected and also severely affected trust in the company's management. The impact of Michelle's testimony was immediate. The hearing panel listened intently, and the expressions on their faces revealed the seriousness with which they were treating the matter. Carlos realized that his position was becoming even more precarious. Michelle wasn't just exposing his conduct, but was also placing his attitude in a context that directly linked him to institutional and discriminatory issues. Carlos tried to stay calm, but the nervousness was evident on his face. He knew that his defense needed a new strategy immediately. The allegation of racial prejudice and the fact that Michelle held an important role in the company were factors that couldn't be ignored. The flight attendant was aware that the case was unfolding in a much more complex way than he had anticipated, and his ability to navigate the situation was diminishing by the minute. With Michelle's testimony clarifying the gravity of the situation and her position of authority within the airline, Carlos realized that the hearing was becoming a bigger challenge than he had imagined. The weight of her words and the implications of his actions were now more evident than ever, and the need for a convincing and sincere response was becoming an urgent priority. As the hearing reached its climax, the panel of authorities seemed to absorb every detail of the situation with heightened attention. After Michelle's detailed testimony, which clarified her role as an evaluator of the crew's performance, it was announced that she would draft a report with recommendations for decision-making by the company's managers. Upon hearing this, Carlos found himself in an even more vulnerable position. The revelation that Michelle was on an official mission to evaluate the crew's performance added an extra layer of seriousness to the situation, but the fact that her report would influence the airline's future decisions made the significance of his actions even more evident. Carlos felt a knot in his stomach as he realized the magnitude of what was at stake. The sense that his actions had not only harmed a passenger but also affected his own career and the reputation of the entire company was beginning to solidify. He realized that the impact of his behavior had extended far beyond the specific incident with Michelle, involving institutional and personal issues. When it was his turn to defend himself again, Carlos tried to maintain his composure, but his nervousness was palpable. "I understand that this situation was serious," he began, "and I recognize that my conduct was questionable. However, I'd like to explain that my attitude wasn't motivated by pure racism. I have a complicated history with law enforcement, particularly with black officers, due to a past incident that left a mark on me." He hesitated, trying to find the right words. "What happened was a confrontation with an officer that made me develop a negative perception of them. I acknowledge that this isn't an excuse and that my actions were disproportionate. I'm not a racist, but I admit that my personal experiences influenced my behavior in the wrong way." Michelle listened intently, and her expression conveyed a mixture of disappointment and resolve. When given the opportunity to respond, she made it clear that while she understood that Carlos's past might have influenced his actions, it didn't lessen the gravity of what happened. Regardless of Carlos's past experiences, discriminatory behavior is unacceptable. Everyone has a duty to treat others with respect and fairness, regardless of their personal experiences, she continued, her voice filled with conviction. What's been exposed here isn't just a lapse in judgment or a moment of weakness, it's a fundamental failure to understand and respect others' rights. The attitude that was demonstrated can't be justified by personal experiences, especially when one holds a position of responsibility. Michelle's words resonated strongly in the room. Carlos realized that he was facing not only a critique of his specific conduct, but also a deeper reflection on his biases and behaviors. The impact of Michelle's testimony and the recognition of her position within the airline made the reality of his actions undeniable. With a calm determination, Michelle continued her remarks, addressing Carlos directly. Her voice was firm but carried a sincere concern for the integrity of the service provided and the importance of mutual respect. "Carlos," she began, "as a flight attendant, your duty is to treat all passengers with the utmost respect and professionalism, regardless of their race, color, or any other personal characteristic. The standard of service must be consistent and fair, without your own experiences or prejudices interfering with your behavior." Carlos listened attentively, and every word Michelle said seemed to penetrate deeper into his consciousness. His previously defensive posture began to shift as he reflected on the real impact of his actions. Michelle's explanation made him acknowledge the severity of his mistake. He had allowed a past incident to negatively influence his actions, resulting in behavior that was not only inappropriate but also detrimental to the company's reputation and the dignity of the passengers he was supposed to serve. The realization that his failure had larger implications than he initially imagined was a hard blow for Carlos. He began to understand that his behavior wasn't just a matter of an isolated mistake, but reflected a deeper flaw in his ability to treat others with the dignity and respect they deserved. Regret began to settle in his heart, and he realized that he needed to face the consequences of his actions. When the hearing concluded, the panel's decision was finally announced. Carlos was demoted from his position as head of the flight attendants and received an indefinite suspension. The decision was a reflection of the seriousness with which the airline and airport management treated the situation, and the disciplinary action not only punished inappropriate behavior but also sent a clear message about the importance of maintaining high standards of respect and professionalism. Carlos accepted the decision with a mixture of resignation and helplessness, knowing that the road ahead would be challenging and that his professional reputation had been severely damaged. During the suspension period, he would have time to reflect on his mistakes and work on his understanding of prejudice and respect. This time would also be crucial for him to find ways to repair the damage caused and improve his professional practices and future attitudes. As she disconnected from the meeting and left the hearing, Michelle felt a mix of relief and sadness. Although the outcome was a victory in terms of justice and accountability, she knew the process had been painful and that the impact of her actions on Carlos and the airline would be long-lasting. However, the experience had been an opportunity to address deep issues of respect and professionalism, something she hoped could bring positive changes in the long term. A few hours later, Michelle found a moment of calm to reflect on what had happened. Sitting in a cafe still at the Florida airport, she mentally reviewed the day's events. The atmosphere around her was calm, contrasting with the tension she had faced just moments earlier. Although the process had been exhausting, Michelle felt she had fulfilled her duty by ensuring that unacceptable behavior was confronted and that measures were taken. Then, she reviewed her notes and began to prepare the report. Michelle knew that her observations about Carlos's behavior would now be part of a crucial document that would be sent to the relevant airline authorities. The report would not only detail the specific incident but also include recommendations to prevent similar situations from happening in the future. Michelle hoped that her experience would not be in vain and that by reporting Carlos's behavior, she could contribute to significant improvements in the management and training of the crew. Her thoughts then turned to the next step in her mission. Michelle was about to board a new flight to Georgia, and she knew there was still much work to be done. She prepared for this new flight with the same determination with which she faced the hearing. There was a greater goal in mind: to ensure that the airline adopted stricter and more inclusive practices, promoting a more respectful and professional environment for all passengers and employees. As she reviewed the report, Michelle reflected on the importance of documenting and reporting cases of discrimination and inappropriate behavior. She understood that by sharing her experience and observations, she was contributing to a system that could quickly identify and correct flaws. The goal was to ensure that other passengers' experiences weren't compromised in the same way hers had been. Her decision to report Carlos's behavior to the relevant authorities had been a difficult but necessary choice. She knew that the impact of her actions could help prevent future incidents and improve the quality of customer service. Michelle remained firm in her conviction that positive change was possible and that the responsibility of each individual in a position of power was essential to ensuring a fair and respectful work environment and flight experience. As she boarded her next flight to Georgia, Michelle carried with her a renewed sense of purpose. The episode with Carlos had been a challenge, but also an opportunity to make a difference. She hoped that after her report and recommendations, she could influence significant and lasting changes within the airline. As the plane took off, Michelle looked out the window and reflected on the road ahead. She knew that her journey was far from over, but she felt confident that by maintaining her commitment to justice and respect, she was contributing to a better future for both the airline and the passengers who depended on it. During the flight to Georgia, Michelle settled into her seat, looking out the window as the plane gently lifted off the ground. The horizon began to open up before her, and she allowed herself a moment of reflection. Michelle imagined the impact of her report and the potential of her observations to promote a more respectful and inclusive environment. She hoped that by highlighting Carlos's inappropriate behavior, she was helping to prevent other passengers from going through the same uncomfortable and humiliating situation. Her intention was clear: to use her experience to drive positive reforms and ensure that higher standards of service and respect were established. Already at the center of the airline's operations, the news of Carlos's misconduct had spread quickly. The reflection and shock over the true severity of the situation had led to a series of internal reactions. Carlos, even after just a few hours, faced the weight of the implications of his actions. The impact of his behavior was widely discussed, and the need for structural reforms became a clear priority for the management. The newly created committee was tasked with supervising and evaluating the crew's behavior with greater rigor. The reforms introduced aimed to ensure that high standards of professionalism and respect were maintained. Additionally, a monitoring system would be implemented to ensure that customer service practices were correctly followed and that any inappropriate behavior was promptly identified and addressed. The airline had already been mobilizing to implement new guidelines for crew training, emphasizing the importance of treating all passengers with fairness and dignity, regardless of their personal characteristics. But the episode of Carlos's prejudice against Michelle only accelerated things. As the plane flew through the blue sky, Michelle mentally reviewed the changes she wanted to see implemented. The committee that had been created to oversee the crew's behavior seemed to be a step in the right direction. The creation of a dedicated committee not only signaled a serious response to the incident but also an intention to proactively address issues before new problems arose. Michelle, still reflecting on these changes as the flight approached Georgia, felt a wave of hope. The fact that her experience was driving a reassessment of the airline's practices and encouraging positive reforms brought a sense of accomplishment. She knew that there was still much work to be done and that real change would come over time, but she was convinced that she had taken a significant step toward a fairer and more prejudice-free environment. The flight landed smoothly in Georgia, and Michelle prepared for the next chapter of her mission. Her journey had been filled with challenges, but also with opportunities to create a positive impact. In the months following the incident, the airline underwent a visible transformation. The changes implemented after Carlos's case began to yield noticeable results. Passenger satisfaction increased significantly, reflecting a substantial improvement in the quality of service and the professionalism of the crew. Most importantly, crew morale also experienced a significant boost. The intensive training on diversity and inclusion, driven by Carlos's case, was adopted throughout the airline. These trainings addressed not only the importance of equitable and respectful service, but also challenged team members to recognize and deal with personal and professional biases. The inclusion of real-life examples, such as the prejudice Michelle had experienced, helped illustrate the negative impacts of prejudice and the need for inclusive practices in a concrete way. Thus, the incident was transformed into a fundamental case study in the airline's training programs. Managers and customer service teams participated in interactive sessions discussing how personal biases could affect the work environment and customer service. The goal was to create greater awareness and understanding of the importance of treating all passengers with dignity and respect, regardless of their personal characteristics. The proactive approach to training led many crew members to reflect on their own attitudes and behaviors, fostering a more empathetic and professional environment. During the implementation of the new policies within the airline, Michelle played a key role that went beyond the mere execution of the reforms. Her personal experience, transformed into an educational tool, was central to consolidating the importance of the changes and ensuring that all employees understood the seriousness of discriminatory behavior. Michelle began to get directly involved in training, leading sessions and lectures for the crew and customer service staff. Instead of simply discussing policies and guidelines, she used her personal account to illustrate the real and painful effects of prejudice. Her stories about the incident with Carlos were not just a description of what had happened, but a sincere portrayal of the emotional and professional impact that discrimination had caused. Michelle's approach brought a human and realistic perspective to the training, helping to create a deeper connection with the participants. During these sessions, Michelle spoke about the importance of treating everyone with respect, emphasizing that as professionals, it was essential to set aside personal differences and maintain integrity and dignity in customer service. She discussed how small actions and words could have significant repercussions, and how understanding and empathy were crucial to creating a welcoming and inclusive environment. By sharing her experience so openly and directly, Michelle offered a vivid example of how discriminatory behavior can be harmful and how positive changes can emerge from adversity. Michelle's active participation in training also served to reinforce the gravity of the reforms introduced by the airline. Her testimony helped turn the new policies from mere paper into living, practical actions. Employees who may have viewed the guidelines as mere formalities began to understand the importance of applying them seriously. Michelle's personal involvement made the policies not just an obligation but a shared responsibility for everyone. The effectiveness of these approaches was quickly reflected in the continuous improvement in passenger satisfaction and crew morale. Positive feedback began to accumulate over time, with passengers noting a significant difference in the team's service and courtesy. Crew morale steadily increased, with many employees expressing gratitude for the opportunity to learn and grow from Michelle's shared experience. The atmosphere on board became more collaborative and respectful, evidenced by the team's willingness to support each other and provide more empathetic and attentive service. Even months after the incident, Michelle's constant presence as a mentor and educator helped keep the focus on the reforms and ensure that the lessons learned from the incident were consistently applied. Her influence not only consolidated the importance of the changes, but also created a culture of responsibility and respect within the airline. In the end, Michelle's work demonstrated that true change doesn't come just from implementing new policies but from creating a deep understanding and shift in attitude among all team members. Her personal experience and the impact it had on training were essential in ensuring that the airline not only adopted new practices but also deeply incorporated them into its operations. After completing her initial mission with the airline, Michelle found a deep sense of fulfillment. The work she had invested in not only brought visible and significant changes to the company but also became a rich opportunity for personal learning and growth. Reflecting on her journey, she realized that her experience was more than just resolving an incident, it was a chance to influence and inspire lasting cultural transformation. With the success of the ongoing reforms and the implementation of the new policies, Michelle decided to continue her involvement with the airline. She felt there was valuable opportunity to deepen her impact and promote even broader change. By working to promote equality and combat prejudice, Michelle used her experience to build a legacy of respect and inclusion within the company. From there, Michelle's mission wasn't limited to training sessions. She also initiated a continuous feedback program where employees could share their experiences and suggest improvements to promote a fairer environment. This program was well received, and employee contributions helped refine practices and proactively address emerging issues. Her dedication to the cause also led her to join external committees that discussed diversity and inclusion policies in the aviation industry. By sharing her experience and collaborating with other organizations, Michelle helped bring a practical and effective perspective to broader debates on how to address biases and promote a more equitable culture. In this way, Carlos's case also extended beyond the airline's borders. Michelle's experience and the subsequent response from the company became an example of how to effectively handle prejudice issues. Other sectors of aviation and even companies outside the industry began to consider the airline's approach as a model to follow. The reforms and practices implemented generated interest and recognition in broader circles, highlighting the importance of a serious commitment to diversity and inclusion. For Michelle, the work wasn't just about correcting a mistake, it was about creating a legacy of positive change. She saw her experience as a catalyst for a continuous dialogue on equality and respect. The transformation she helped initiate within the airline extended beyond the company's boundaries, inspiring other organizations and professionals to rethink and reformulate their own practices. Thus, the incident with Carlos triggered a transformation process never seen before. Through Michelle's experience and the subsequent creation of new policies and training, the airline adopted a more rigorous and conscious approach to diversity and inclusion. It not only corrected a flaw but also reinvented itself, becoming a model of respect and professionalism in the industry. As for Carlos, the incident became a turning point. Initially marked by negative reaction and resistance, he faced an opportunity for introspection and change. The experience forced him to confront his biases and consider the seriousness of his actions. Although the demotion and suspension were severe, the punishment was also an opportunity for him to reflect and rehabilitate. The impact of his behavior, exposed publicly and critically, led him to reassess his attitudes and seek genuine personal development. In the end, Michelle and Carlos's case demonstrated that even negative situations can be transformed into valuable opportunities for growth and learning. Michelle's experience not only brought changes within the company but also set a standard for the industry, showing that a serious commitment to inclusion and respect can result in significant and lasting improvements. I hope you enjoyed this story full of twists and emotions. If you liked it and want more exciting narratives like this, don't forget to give it a like, activate the Tinkerbell, and subscribe to the Stories Life channel. Here, each story is a new adventure, and we are always ready to surprise you. Also leave your comment on what you thought of the story and suggestions for future narratives. See you next time.